Okay, so in this video, we're going to be looking at how to create pie charts in base R. Now, in my example, I'm going to use data that I used in a previous video, but I've modified it slightly. Pie charts, generally, you don't want to go too much over 7 slices. And in my previous data that I had like 10 or 11 slices, 10 or 11 categories. And so what I've done is in this age data, instead of having 80 to 89 and 90 to 99 and then 100 and over, I combined those last 3 categories into a single category, so that I have only 8 slices, I believe, um, instead of 10. So one of my categories had a 0 value, 0 percentage in it anyway. So it was just making the labels run on top of each other. So I've reduced the data. I've combined a couple of these categories at the end just to make the data a little bit nicer when we try to graph it. All right, so here's my percent data. And so I'm going to go ahead and enter that into my memory. And then here are the age category data, my labels that I'm going to use to create my graph. So we've got our categories based on age range. And so I'm also going to run that. Now, remember to keep in mind, pie charts are not really necessarily well liked in data science, partly because they are really very simple graphs. They can really only display graphs of a data of a particular type. Your percentages all have to add up to 100%. It has to make sense as part of a whole. And other kinds of graphs like bar graphs or things like that are much more flexible in terms of those requirements. So pie charts are, kind of frowned upon a little bit, but they're very common in statistics, and certain types of fields like business really like them. And so we're going to talk about how to make them in base R. Now, if I can just plot the percentages by themselves using this pie function, then I'm going to get a graph that just has the categories labeled, and that's it. So here I guess I have 9 categories. Okay, great. So again, that's the rule of thumb is not more than 7 categories, and you can see partly you don't want really, really tiny categories because they do tend to, the numbers start overlapping on each other. Now, this is not very informative. 1 through 9 doesn't really mean very much. So I'm going to add some labels using my age category data. And so if I add that information, again, I'm having some overlap here. If I use the zoom function, the text will be a little bit smaller and they won't actually overlap with each other. If you wanted to combine, say, 70 and above instead of having 80 and above as your last category, you could modify this data to combine these 2 last percentages into a single group, and then you wouldn't have this overlap. But again, if you zoom onto the graph, then you'll get a thing that will pop up, a window that will pop up, and we'll just glance at it for a second. And you can see that the overlap isn't quite as severe. You can actually read these. But this overlap was the reason that I reduced the number of categories to begin with. All right, so if we go back to our screen, I also can sort of tweak my data, my graph a little bit. Maybe I don't want a pie chart, I don't want a circle, but maybe I want a nonagon. In this case, I want a shape that has 9 edges. Since I have 9 categories, I can actually do that and turn this into these edges. Instead of curves, they're straight lines. I don't know what benefit that is, but it is a thing that you can do. You can also change the design of the graph a little bit by doing hash marks. So here we would specify some sort of density of the hashes, and then also specify the angle that we want the hashes to be styled at so that we can tell them apart. Don't make them like really similar next to each other. You want them to be at different enough angles that you can see the change very easily. And so we run that. So you get, again, this is standard pie chart shape, but here the shading is in different edges, now different directions. Now again, kind of keep in mind what might you want to use this. You would generally want to use this when you can only do print in black and white and not in color. Now, if you want to change the color of our plot, instead of using these default colors, you can, and we can use the package color brewer to do that. Here, I'm going to specify a palette of 9 colors since I have 9 categories. There are different sets of colors that you can use from the color brewer package. Now, set 2 has a maximum size of 8 colors, which is fine for most pie charts if you stick to that 7 or fewer categories. But it doesn't really work here for 9 because I'll start repeating color categories. So I'm going to pick a palette of 9 colors in this example from set 3. And then I'm going to add a border for my slices in black. And I'm going to choose my colors from this color palette that I just created. And if I run that, I get a nice selection of colors. Now, I can also choose from example set 1 also has enough that I can do 9 colors. And here I will just change the border instead of black to white, just to change the pace. And now I get something that looks like this. Again, these are slightly brighter colors than the previous set. These are more pastel. But your choice. And feel free to play around with these. Choose a palette that is consistent with the size of the number of slices that you have on your graph. Now, I will say that you can't really do a donut graph very easily in base R, and so I'm not going to do that example because you really have to program the entire thing from scratch. It's really kind of horrendous. When we do these tutorials for ggplot, then it'll be much easier to do a donut version of a pie chart in ggplot than it is in base R. And so when we do the pie charts in ggplot, then we'll look at the donut version of it. But in this case, these are the options that you have for the standard base pie chart in base R.